Hello from Ljubljana. One of the lines of thought that has been opened up at Theory Underground over the last couple of months is the question of religion. I had a variety of guests on for an epic marathon live stream where the relation between theology, philosophy, and politics was central. You are about to see the conversation we had with Dr. Adrian Johnston, who is basically a pretty hardcore atheist and materialist, as well as one of the best philosophy professors and most cutting-edge theorists in the scene today. With a serious basis in German idealism, Marxism, and psychoanalysis, there are few atheists who have the chops to speak on the ways that religion is seemingly re-entering the theory scene. There's also some fascinating discussion of the analytic versus continental divide in philosophy. If you are curious about what Theory Underground is, are interested in getting involved, or seek to support this work, then stick around to the end of the video for the PSA. There will also, at some point, probably about halfway through this, be an ad for an upcoming course that begins in June. We really hope that you'll be able to make it to that. I hope that you'll enjoy this episode.
All right, everybody, welcome to Theory Underground. I'm your host, David McKerracher, with my co-host, Nance here. And today we're joined by Dr. Adrian Johnston. How are you doing, Adrian?
I'm doing well. How are the two of you?
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
I've been up since 3 a.m. Doing this marathon live stream thing, and I'd say we're a little over the halfway point at this point. Feeling good, feeling refreshed. But your presence in the epic marathon stream, it is significant for the actual conversation, the topics that we have for this conversation. And I just want to say really quick to the people who are listening to this as a standalone episode on podcasts in the future, as well as people who are watching it as a standalone YouTube video in the future, you don't have to go watch the whole, 17 hours or whatever to get the context of the conversation. I'll kind of just give you a sense for it. But basically, we've had a variety of people on talking about the future of humanity, the crises that are impending, psychoanalysis, class, capital, and religion has been a really big sort of repeated theme. And it keeps rearing its ugly head over the course of the last, I would say, 2 years, mostly. I mean, I've been in the world of philosophy and theory now for a long time. We get these people who are into, religion, who come to a philosophy club and they're like the little outcast person. And that's been my experience for the last 12 years. And we're seeing, I think right now, some kind of a resurgence. And maybe that's good. And I have had people on today who do think that it's good, but I wanted to bring on a certified atheist, someone who's thought longer and harder about materialism and a kind of psychoanalytic Marxism that is atheist down to its bones. And so that's you, Adrian. I want to hear, why is atheism so important to you?
Well, I mean, part of it indeed does have to do with the surprising resilience and persistence of various forms of religiosity right up through our present. And of course, I emerge in part out of an intellectual history of philosophy background that involves, figures in terms of, as you pointed out, some of my work deals with Marxism, psychoanalysis, and their interrelationships. And, if you start with, say, Marx and Freud as the two, founders of, those two traditions, that both of them inherit this 18th century Enlightenment style optimism that inevitably the future course of human social history will move, ever further in the direction of, full secularization, and that, they both each, Marx and Freud, each in his own way, give voice to this underlying confidence. Again, a very Enlightenment style confidence that indeed, as history will continue to unfold, we will see the, however, gradual or abrupt withering away of religiosity, and of course, obviously, for any intellectually honest person in the 21st century, looking at these sorts of predictions and expectations in these traditions, it's glaringly obvious that history after Marx and Freud refused to conform to their expectations, defied their predictions, and this is, for traditions like Marxism and psychoanalysis, I think this remains a serious question. How do we make sense of what Lacan, being, uncharacteristically critical of Freud, Lacan gave this interview in 1974 in Rome that was published under the title "The Triumph of Religion," and in which he said, well, in this case, yes, Freud was quite wrong, and what we've instead witnessed is this resurgence of religiosity. And Lacan, in the 70s, was already predicting the rise of virulently ethnocentric, racist forms of ethnic identity, including involving religions. And I'm very interested in coming up with an explanation for this. From the traditional standpoints of things like Marxism, psychoanalysis, this utterly surprising resilience and endurance of the religious, and trying to account for that, but on the basis, like, for Marx and Freud, as they would demand, explaining this in very, strictly secular, even materialist terms, right? And to be able to account for, not just, as a standard type of materialistic atheist, you just say, oh, it's all supernaturalistic bunk and nonsense, to say, well, it's still a socio-historical and collective, cultural, et cetera, phenomena or set of phenomena, and it therefore has to be explained, and insofar as one is going to do so from an atheistic, materialistic standpoint, that one needs a form of materialist analysis or a type of atheism that isn't just the kind of crude, dismissive. I mean, here I'm thinking of, like, Dawkins and Hitchens type atheism, one that takes seriously, even though it doesn't believe in what the content of these religious phenomena, that still attempts to provide this worldly account for the genesis, a development and persistence of things like religiosity, including very much in our present context. So that's there's a lot more that could be said along these lines, but I think it would be good for me to allow for a follow-up here and just kind of keep the conversation going.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. And so the triumph of religion then for Lacan, I wonder, was this a turning point in his work? And then I'm going to add a couple things to that. I remember, I don't know, I was like binging your stuff in preparation for an interview with you like a year and a half ago, and then it didn't happen. But I have recollection of things that I read from you where you said things along the lines like, there's even these unfortunate moments in Lacan. Like you use adjectives like unfortunate, where you're talking about how much slack or credence or like leeway, I guess, that he gives to religiosity, right? And I think we're seeing a rise in this sort of very religious friendly kind of Lacanianism. We just had on, for instance, maybe 2-3 guests ago, Dwayne Roussel, right? I think he's really into it. As an example, Mark Gerard Murphy would be another one. And you're kind of in that world of Lacan. And it's interesting because most Marxists are going to be more like Chris Catrone or Doug Lane. Like for them, it's just like they're not super into the psychoanalysis. And if they are, it's more like Freud instead of Lacan. And so you're kind of this enigma in this sense, right? So what is Lacan doing for you and your materialism? And why do you think he's maybe potentially problematic or opening up this kind of religious can of worms?
Right. Well, the place that I think you have in mind where, I am critical of certain of Lacan's recourses to religious references, well, this would be in, I believe it would be one of the early chapters of my 2013 book, the first volume of the Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism trilogy.
Yeah.
And yes, and that involves me focusing on a particularly striking moment, a single session of Lacan's fourth seminar, The Object Relation, which he gave in the academic year 1956 to 1957. And in a session of that fourth seminar that Lacan's son-in-law Jacques-Alain Miller entitled, "The Signifier and the Holy Spirit," Lacan does have explicit and very positive sounding recourse to the Christian conception of the Holy Spirit. Of course, for Lacan, very much bound up with his conception of what he calls the symbolic order. And in particular, Lacan has these, during this middle period of his teaching, the 1950s era return to Freud, Lacan's epistemological sensibilities are very Kantian. And so Lacan wants to say that, for instance, whatever lies beyond, behind, or beneath language, both, a pre-linguistic period in an individual's life history, as well as, of course, at the collective level, whatever there was, prior to recorded human history, prior to the symbolization of history, prior to, the advent of language itself, that Lacan, on basically for Kantian critical epistemological reasons during this time, is adamantly opposed to any talk of the real before the symbolic, apart from the symbolic, and along with this says, well, when we ask about the origins of language, for instance, this will inevitably lead us astray. It is an unanswerable question, and so we have to treat the birth of language as this almost like this ex nihilo mythic moment that is akin to the Holy Spirit, the advent of the Holy Spirit. And so there's this, in a way, Kantian epistemological motivated, insistence that asking after, for instance, the, real, natural material, history and basis for the origin of human beings, and especially of language and everything that language brings with it. He just pronounces all of that epistemologically out of bounds. And in place of, any answer, impossible answers to these unanswerable questions about things like the origin of language, we have to have recourse instead to these sort of more mythic religious intuitions, and talk about language like the always already here Holy Spirit. And for me, there are just a number of serious philosophical problems with that position that Lacan occupies, in places like the Fourth Seminar in the mid 1950s. But he beginning especially, I think, in the 1960s, he radically reconsiders how he thinks about the relationship between, the linguistic and the non-linguistic, the registers of the symbolic and the real, et cetera, and does so in a way where he ends up, I think, being implicitly much closer to someone like Hegel than to Kant. And along with that, he opens up the possibility of developing a more materialist or naturalist type of approach to some of what he is dealing with psychoanalytically. Now, when he gets to the Triumph of Religion, that's 1974. So it's rather late in his itinerary. And one of the things that I think is really important that he observes, and that this is a kind of a new insight of his in that from this 1974 interview. For Freud specifically, Freud thought that what would bring about relentless secularization, what would basically guarantee this Enlightenment progress narrative's fulfillment, that we would eventually lose our religion and be ushered into a purely secular or atheistic age. Lacan says, well, Freud pins his hopes for this on science and technology, and that as science and technology advance, that in a zero-sum conflict with religion, the greater the amount of science and technology in play socioculturally, the less amount of religion, and eventually science and technology will just push religion entirely out of the picture. Lacan says, yeah, it's precisely because it's not that religion has survived despite the advances of science and technology, it's precisely because of the relentless advances of science and technology. As this knowledge and know-how of a secular scientific sort renders more and more of our reality just this brute, meaningless material real of matter, etc., the more estranged and alienated human beings feel, and that essentially we cling even harder to religion with the advance of science and technology, so as to provide us with this, with an anchor of meaning on what otherwise we experience as this ever-growing sea of senselessness. That is the scientifically and technologically mathematized and manipulated material reality we inhabit. And so it's the very thing Freud thought would, produce secularization has instead produced, virulent returns of the religious, including these new forms of fundamentalism, et cetera. And I think that's a very important insight and a clue to, Marxists who are grappling with these issues would do well to take a page out of this later Lacan's book and to take seriously what Lacan indicates in terms of what could be executed as a Marxist historical materialist account for why in the 21st century we see a veritable flourishing of religious fundamentalisms, et cetera, where we were expecting, from a more traditional Enlightenment style perspective, to see instead, the ever increasing secularization or becoming atheistic of humanity. Does that help? I know there's some other aspects that need to be answered, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess one of my follow-up questions was going to be about your materialism. I know that's a real can of worms. You wrote 3 prolegomena to any future materialisms. I understand. I've heard from people who've been in your lectures before. You're working out your materialism. Like, it sounds like a lot of. I'm fascinated. I would do anything to go to your university and actually take some classes there. You have like. Quick side note for people who don't know, because I did this when I had people from Duquesne as well. University of New Mexico is one of the top places in the world that you want to go if you want to study philosophy, the kind of stuff that we're into here. If you actually get to go there, my God, like I love everything you're doing, but also Dr. Adrian that's you. No, Dr. Ian Thompson has also been totally amazing to us and has done really cool stuff with us in the past. But I want to, basically ask you this question about materialism. What are some of the, you're solving for something, or at least you're correcting for something that's coming out of materialism. Like, so there's a problem with the state of materialisms up till us. And you're kind of saying, okay, going forward, we need to do things with materialism differently. And so I kind of want to just set you up to kind of, what is it? What is wrong with materialism, and what do you hope for it in the future?
Excellent. And thank you also for the kind words about our department at the University of New Mexico. And yes, if you're interested in this sort of material and are thinking of graduate school, please do consider us. But thanks for that. So I would say that we can talk about this both from the standpoint of what is going on with, we could say, materialism today, with the contemporary, especially continental metaphysical theoretical landscape and the various appeals to materialism. And then in addition, and especially I think to explain the particularities of the version of materialism I advocate for, I will need to have recourse to a little bit of a historical narrative, starting with the German idealists. But first with the contemporary situation of materialism in theory. One of the things that I found frustrating over the past couple of decades is that it seems as though, on the one hand, there is an ever increasing consensus that, whatever is involved in the term materialism, that this is the right path to pursue, that the bulk of contemporary continental metaphysicians, people doing work in that neck of the woods, that you have this proliferation of people and orientations laying claim to, the term materialism and saying, what is being put forward here is a materialism. But of course, at the same time, this very popularity and this proliferation of different, uses of the term materialism by, these recent and contemporary philosophers and theorists, is that the term has clearly lost all meaning. That you have, I mean, just, and I'm very, influenced by Badiou's work, et cetera. But, Badiou talks about what is, a kind of Platonic mathematical formalist ontology as materialist. You have others who will talk about a materialism of things like culture, et cetera, but in a way where it's something that is not tangible. It's not something that has to do with, for instance, the kind of matter that we deal with when we do natural science, et cetera. It's some type of other quote unquote matter. But when the word matter or the word materialism is used to even be able to allow for taking positions like things that resemble Platonic metaphysical realism and call it materialism, clearly there's a problem. And it's just it just gets debased to being a vague, fuzzy, even ambiguous journalistic buzzword that doesn't really mean much. And so, unlike a lot of my contemporaries, especially in continental philosophy, I insist that you cannot have a materialism that is not bound up with a certain, at least qualified type of naturalism. In other words, the sense that there is an ontological prioritization of the sorts of entities and events that we tend to think of as falling under the explanatory jurisdiction of the modern empirical experimental natural sciences. And that also, of course, brings with it certain epistemological obligations for philosophers or theorists vis-a-vis the sciences. And without that sense of being tethered to and conditioned by a naturalism that would give a certain priority to disciplines like the natural sciences and the development of any materialism, I think that if it doesn't involve that at all, in order to even have the word materialism retain, I think a pretty sharp, clear meaning and indicate a position that really is taking a stance that is incompatible with other things, rather than just being a buzzword that you can assume you could subsume all manner of different incompatible projects under the heading of. That this is something I'm very adamant about, so there's that dimension. So my naturalistic and science inclined tendencies are do indeed set me apart, and this is because at least in continental philosophy, I mean, it's funny, Anglo-American analytic philosophers are usually much more receptive to when I'm talking about things like neuroscience, cognitive science, various aspects of biology, et cetera, these being the sorts of empirical scientific reference points that are most important for the kind of work I do. They're much more receptive. Usually continental audiences spit venom at me. And this has to do with the fact that, the origins of continental philosophy in the late 18th, early 19th century German-speaking world, were already colored from the get-go by various, anti-Enlightenment and especially anti-Newtonian style natural science sensibilities, as reflected in the Romantics, the Pietists, etc. And all of this ends up infusing itself into, you might say, the original DNA of what we've come to call continental philosophy. And generally, this is a big generalization, but it's still, I think, not entirely inaccurate. From Kant to the present, most of continental philosophy has been marked implicitly or explicitly by an anti-naturalist, science-phobic, tendency, a deep suspicion that, if you dance with the scientific devil, you're going to lose your soul, as it were, and, need to put in the sense of, the big philosophical struggle in modernity is to push back against, the nihilistic expansion, of the natural sciences and, the leveling down of everything to quantifiable matter, et cetera, in the sense that that's the big spiritual threat that continental philosophy sees itself as fighting against. And hence why you also have the popularity periodically of these returns to religion in various corners of the continental world, right? In that sense of, okay, this is just a new version of fighting that old battle, between, religion and science, reason and faith, and continental philosophy seeing itself as wanting to set limits to, going back to Kant, like, he limits reason to leave room for faith, as he himself said, right? And I'm interested in pushing back against that in continental philosophy, and instead coming up with a continental philosophy that would be science friendly rather than science phobic, and that would, be able to, apart from fighting an atheistic fight against religion, would also be able to, explain key things that are dear to us as continentalists to people who would not otherwise be sympathetic to continental philosophy, not to just keep using the same jargonistic smoke and mirrors and referring to, all of these things that can't be captured by science, et cetera, but to facing even the most, skeptical, hard-nosed, down-to-earth, kind of empirically minded, science-friendly type person, being able to show that there's a lot that the continental tradition still has to offer. But this, of course, requires reworking it in certain ways. But then historically, right? I mean, for me, in terms of what's distinctive about how I approach materialism, I'll start with what isn't distinctive, which is that, here the roots of my way of thinking about materialism lie in a combination of German idealist and Marxist influences, and ones that are related to each other, in that, you have especially Schelling and Hegel develop in different ways at different times in their itineraries what they called Naturphilosophie, philosophy of nature, which is much closer to what I'm interested in terms of a serious philosophical engagement of a certain sort with the sciences and with nature conceived of as the explanatory jurisdiction of those disciplines. That philosophy of those versions of the philosophy of nature developed by the two of them, which then influence people like Engels, who develops dialectical materialism as a kind of extension of Marx's own historical materialism. It's really that combination of German idealist philosophies of nature with Marx and Engels's historical and dialectical materialisms that is sort of the ultimate background historical inspiration for the sort of materialism I'm trying to develop. But there are in here I can now spell out what's distinct about it. So let's take, for simplicity's sake, just take classical Engelsian dialectical materialism. And I could say that what I call transcendental materialism is a kind of historical offshoot or variant of Marxist historical materialism. But when you look at the classical version of what Marxists call historical materialism, whether they agree with it or not, it's clear that what is being advanced there, what Engels himself puts forward and certain of his successors, run with, is a materialism that involves both what we could call a kind of organicist holism, where it's the idea that ultimately, everything is a matter of nature, but nature in its totality is this seamlessly interconnected whole. It is this harmonious, grand scale integration of these various and sundry different dimensions, and very much echoing both certain of the ancient Greeks as well as Spinoza, with these things lying behind the Schellingian philosophy of nature that's partly influencing Engels here. You have the idea of, as the Greeks put it, hen kai pan, one is all is one, right? So you have this big picture holism or organicism about natural being as the ultimate horizon, and everything is integrated with everything else. And then in addition, you have with classical Engelsian dialectical materialism, when Engels explains it, it often sounds like part of what's involved is a kind of Heraclitean, flux doctrine, a sort of process metaphysics, to use a phrase associated with Whitehead, and where everything is change, becoming, ceaseless transformation, temporal restlessness, etc. So you have these two dimensions. You have the organic style holism and the kind of flux doctrine, process metaphysics sides of classical dialectical materialism. And I think that both of these are problematic. I think that ultimately, if you have this picture of being at its most foundational nature, if with Engels you identify that as nature as a whole, if your picture of it is of this totally self-integrated, conflict-free, at one with itself, megasphere, then you don't have any negativity there, within nature in terms of inconsistencies or antagonisms between its elements that would drive any development. So it's as though he can't have the process metaphysics, flux doctrine picture with the vision of nature that he has, right? That it's that you would end up with the old problem that the Neoplatonists and Spinoza faced, which was, well, if being is just fundamentally one, why does this one ever deign to emanate? Why does it seem to give rise to anything that at least appears to be other than itself, right? Why does it fragment itself into the many of a plurality of individuatable entities and events, et cetera? And so if you subscribe to at the level of fundamental ontology or organicist holism, you usually end up saddled, and I think Engels does end up saddled, with this same old problem that I don't think you can resolve if you're committed to the idea that essentially, as we could put it in old Platonic terms, being is one rather than many. So I'm interested in developing an ontology, including an ontology of nature, where nature is conceived of not as an organic whole, but as a domain of clashes and conflicts between heterogeneous elements, where there's a denial of any kind of fundamental oneness, where being as nature at its most foundational is many rather than one, to put it rather broadly. And then apropos the kind of process metaphysics flux doctrine side of Engelsian dialectical materialism, one of the problems I have with it, and it's a problem that had Marx, I think, had his attention drawn to it, he might have himself objected. Like, Marx has this wonderful moment at the end of the 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse notebooks, where he brings up the case of Homer's epic poetry, and he says, "Look, all right, when we have something like Homeric epic poetry, the problem for us as historical materialists is not what you would typically think, which is, all right, now we have to show how Homer is a product of his time and place, and that we can situate him in this ancient Greek context, and say all these things about the history that and the social context responsible for this art." And you would think that that's what a Marxist historical materialist would want to do, but Marx says no. The real enigma here for historical materialism is how something that indeed, like everything in human history, surfaces in a determinate time and place, how it is that certain things that surface in this socio-historical fashion come to take on an ability to transcend their time and place and cut across vast swathes of subsequent human history. And Marx says, I mean, look, here we are in the mid-19th century, and this poetry that we're separated from by a vast gulf of time, and that is situated in an entirely different historical context, still speaks to us, still resonates with us, etc. And so historical materialism there would have to include an account for how certain things that arise from within the historical process can come to enjoy a certain, at least relative, transcendence for a period of time vis-a-vis that history. And this is, for me as well, to come back to the idea of, a flux doctrine or process metaphysics as involved in Engels's vision. I think that insisting that everything is just ceaseless, relentless change, constant becoming, etc., just blots out from view the issue of that there at least seem to be certain instances of phenomena that are integral to our humanity that seem to involve us, as it were, historically giving rise to the thereafter trans-historical, and that there are certain things that can arise both ontogenetically and phylogenetically with human beings that can come to enjoy a resistance to change, that can come to perpetuate themselves in a way that defies the passage of time. And so a materialism as well, which would in a way be able to explain the imminent birth of what we experience as the more eternal dimension of our human experience, or of certain things that seem to involve us, having to do with phenomena that are not historicizable in the way of simply saying, okay, well, we can just see how this is simply a reflection of its time and place. And so those are, that idea of, injecting conflict into the very basis of natural being, contra Engels's organicism, and then insisting that, well, yes, everything arises through the historical process. And so there is that fundamental flux of history, but there are certain things that are generated in that flux which don't just rise and fall in the same way that a lot else that ebbs and flows in the restless currents of of history does. And so that, you might say, would be ways that I would have of signaling some of the, I think, more distinctive features of what I'm doing.
Amazing. Okay, so I think we've probably gotten over so much more territory than I actually thought we'd be able to in this amount of time. So I appreciate your ability to kind of rapid fire fill us in on all of this. Like, you've really set us up. Now, I would like to bookmark a future conversation. I would like to, I don't know, go to bat defending these guys, these romanticists, and like, especially like the relevance of Heidegger, for instance. Like, I will like say, you know, what he's calling fundamental ontology, it has nothing to do with what you're calling fundamental ontology, and it matters. But also he's problematic. And so I just finished teaching a course on being in time, and I'm, you know, I don't think, oh, there's some magical transformation later on. The conservative reactionary revolutionary guy was always there, you know, even in being in time. And so, you know, this is something that I'm tracking, but that doesn't mean that he's, as like, say, Lukács or Bourdieu would say, just the, you know, it's the interior life of the romantic bourgeoisie or whatever, like kind of their approach to him. But I would like to bookmark that conversation for another time, because I'm more interested in getting your perspective on things. And I'm more interested in Nance getting to bring up, I don't know, whatever he's got on mind. I'm sure he wants to say something about Thomas Nail. But really quickly, I want to say something to the chat. So we've got a bunch of people in here very excited about you right now. I think that the link to the chat, if you want to see it, is in the Zoom call, but it'll probably distract you if you look at it. But the Dangerous Maybe's in there.
He should not risk it.
Yeah, probably. So Dangerous Maybe is a blog run by Michael Downs, who's a fellow traveler. He's somebody who's been studying under Todd McGowan, not formally, but like, you know, he's a warehouse worker in Missouri, and he just writes a lot of theory stuff, right? And people like Jennifer Friedlander and Todd McGowan, like, they actually use some of the stuff that Mikey writes in the classroom, because he's really good at like breaking these concepts down for people and stuff like that. So I wanted to do a shout out for Mikey. He really wishes that he could have been here. He really wants to meet you. He says that he owes a tremendous debt to your work. And his question was, he said, if there's time, what is your challenge to Žižek? Oh, sorry. We'll get to Rudy in a second. That's Rudy's question. Mikey's question is what your main criticisms of Deleuze are. He says that he's curious because Deleuze respected science more than most continental thinkers.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Multiple times I've had people suggest to me that I might even be a kind of crypto-Deleuzian, however wittingly or unwittingly. And, you know, there are certain affinities. I mean, to begin with, I think Deleuze has to be given enormous credit for, particularly in the context of the French-speaking philosophical world of the 60s and 70s. You had there, of course, an intellectual context in which, you know, it's almost as though metaphysics had become a bad word, right? And this is the era of, whether appealing to Heidegger, Lyotard, Derrida, etc. I mean, just a whole, you know, there's this consensus that whatever metaphysics is, it's obsolete, it's dangerous, it's to be surpassed, left behind, etc. Perhaps to be declared dead along with philosophy as a whole. All of this sort of rhetoric, these kinds of discourses are circulating, and I really think that Deleuze deserves, to begin with, quite a bit of recognition and admiration for sticking to the project of actually doing metaphysics in a more traditional fashion.
The program will resume shortly, right after this DIY commercial that is not for any sponsor other than ourselves. Thank you for watching.
Whether we are already fully in the grip of the techno-capital AI singularity or not, we likely feel as though there's not much we can do.
As allies of future generations, we aren't giving up so easily.
To quote the author of Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, we wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what our life and our children's lives may be.
This fear is not new.
question of technology, media, and institutions became unavoidable in the 20th century. Yet when we think of institutions, the most radical critiques people have encountered came from either Michel Foucault or Jürgen Habermas. These thinkers towered over the theory scene in the 1970s and 80s as radicals took their long march through the institutions.
When it comes to theories of social change, the tendency is to put our hopes in leaving the existing institutions, the current order failing, or some overnight revolution to bring us salvation. Otherwise, we lean in and do the best we can with what's afforded by the existing institutions. Reform or revolution, nothing ever changes, so we keep putting our hopes in education.
So progressives say, if only more people had access to better education, then that would solve the problems. But they have not thought seriously enough about the nature of our institutions, or this thing called education that they offer.
The most radical critiques of schooling that teachers encounter issue from Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and Henry Giraud, but none of these ever got to the root of institutions themselves. The theorist who did this was Ivan Illich.
Gaining brief stardom in the 70s, Ivan Illich was the father of the deschooling movement, inspiring hundreds of radical schools and generations of homeschooling parents. But this characterization of his work as the anti-school guy was his ultimate demise, for that only takes account of a surface level of his work. Illich was immediately misunderstood and quickly abandoned.
The issue goes far beyond schools. We spend our entire lives mediated through institutions that totalize, instrumentalize, and reduce humans, all of our possibilities, to something predictable, calculable, and exchangeable, easy to control. The interests of state and capital here overlap entirely. Our desires are thus turned into commodities and our time energy into labor power. Illich doesn't stop here, though, for institutions are not the whole picture.
When people think of schooling today, they think of studying for exams, not learning for the sake of learning. When people think of hospitals, they think of treating illnesses, not human-to-human care and well-being. When people think of transportation, they think of speed and efficiency, not the possibility of sustained, regular, and meaningful connections. When people think of reading, they think of collecting information, not lingering with an idea. The move from schooling to schole requires serious inquiry into the conditions of possibility for this mode.
I'm calling for a sincere and earnest revival of Illich. While most introductions to Illich limit their engagement to his earlier works, a series of polemics against schooling and institutionalized consumer society, I want to go deeper and lead us to a more robust understanding of who and what a human is for Illich. With his help, we will reopen the question of what we are, what we can be, and the types of lives we are willing to give our time and energy to bring into being, if there are to be humans in the future.
This course begins on June 13th and goes through July 4th, 2024. It meets on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can enroll at theoryunderground.com/courses/Illich-1, or just click on the link in the description. For those who just want to spend a month really thinking about schooling and institutions, this is a fantastic way to do so. But for those who are looking to go deeper with a community of truth seekers who are going beyond the current theory scene to form an intellectual milieu, this is a fantastic way to do so, because the Theory Underground 2024 conference at the end of October 23rd through 27th is going to have special panels for presentations related to this course. Any student of this course will have opportunities to present, and those presentations can ultimately culminate in submissions that may be accepted into the anthology we are doing on the critique of schooling and education, to be published either at the end of this year or at the beginning of 2025.
Thank you.
We hope to see you there.
in such a hostile environment, but of course doing it in a way that obviously involved taking on board, various and sundry of the insights achieved by, those who would identify as non or post metaphysical in his context, but harnessing the power of some of that intellectual energy around him in the service of developing a rich and sophisticated metaphysics, rather than joining in the choruses decrying its obsolescence, etc. And so there is certainly that. And moreover, of course, there is the fact that Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, his way of reworking the notion of the transcendental after Kant, does involve something similar to what I'm trying to do, what I'm attempting to do, which is to indicate that vis-a-vis things that would have to do with materialism, naturalism, empirical science, etc., that instead of the standard notion of, well, all of that is to be situated in a non-transcendental register. And then when we're doing transcendental philosophy, we're doing philosophy in a way that isn't, conditioned by or reliant upon those sorts of references or supports. In the transcendental philosophy, cannot be naturalized, cannot be, tied to anything material, etc. That, like Deleuze, I am interested in not just abandoning the transcendental, but reworking it such that it ceases to be seen as incompatible with something like materialism, just as Deleuze does that in his own ways under the heading of transcendental empiricism. So I'm very sympathetic to certain aspects of Deleuze, but in the interest of time, and just to put this as succinctly as I can, I think that ultimately for me, Deleuze remains far too Spinozist in terms of his metaphysics. And of course, he's open about this. I'm not saying anything surprising. I mean, he goes so far as to call Spinoza the Christ of philosophy. I mean, this is, the Messiah figure of the entire Western philosophical tradition. And as I develop in various places, and for me here, the key figure is Hegel. Hegel's Kant critique, which, like all Hegelian criticisms, is a complicated, immanent critique that involves passing through rather than bypassing Spinoza, but still so as to move beyond him. That I think that essentially, insofar as Spinoza's metaphysics basically renders the very category of subjectivity as understood in the modern tradition, particularly the German idealists, irrelevant or unthinkable. That a subjectless substance type metaphysics, whether Spinoza's or frankly Deleuze's, for me, for mainly Hegelian reasons, given Hegel's Spinoza critique, I think that Spinoza critique of Hegel's remains very relevant today. And when you look at the offshoots of Deleuzian philosophy in terms of today's, speculative materialisms, or especially what is often called, new materialism, it's usually Deleuzian in character. And it's usually a variant on the kind of Spinozistic notion of, well, you just have this, basically this anonymous, headless, rhizomatic, substance like, ontological network. There aren't really subjects, etc. The traditional ways of thinking about subjectivity are null and void, thanks to this picture, so on and so forth. And to cut a long story short, no, I don't think that's right. And, in my 2014 book, Adventures in Transcendental Materialism, I have a couple of chapters in there on Hegel's Spinoza critique and then its contemporary relevance, especially vis-a-vis Deleuzian-inspired, new speculative materialisms. And yeah, the big problem there is I don't see any place left for subjectivity. And I think that is a serious difficulty that renders those kinds of metaphysical outlooks ultimately untenable and indefensible.
Yeah, I think that is perfect. It not only does it fit so well into what you've been saying about your critique of the two elements of dialectical materialism that you don't like, which is the becoming flux sort of Heraclitus process thing, but also that organic holism, which that was the Spinoza part, right? And so the erasure of the human and the subject is a really big deal in Deleuze, like for us at Theory Underground, especially for Mikey. Mikey's the one who made me aware of it. So hopefully next time I bring you back on here, he'll be here and we'll have longer than 50 minutes. But what he always says is, you know, in Deleuze's world and, you know, D&G's world, you know, there's nothing to stop me from walking up and just putting my hand in your mouth. Why can't I? Why not? You know, and obviously we could think of more horrific things that I could do to another. And the point is like, well, why not? It's all just, you know, machines. They're all just desiring partial objects. Just like make connections, bro. Like, why not? You know?
Yes.
So,
and also any outlook that says, for instance, subjectivity and what we associate with is illusory. I mean, to me, the ultimate fallback is even if you grant that it's illusory, or even if that assertion goes through, illusions are not nothing. And so there's still something there, the illusory itself, which you have to account for, right? For instance, I mean, the big problem with Spinoza is, okay, well, you know, why and or how does this, you know, single, infinite, indivisible substance that is Deus Divina Natura, God or nature, why does it ever bother to fragment itself into a plurality of attributes and modes, which gives rise to, you know, what we experience ordinarily as reality, inclusive of the sense of our own subjectivity and our ability to be self-conscious. And even if you say that's just nothing but a giant veil of appearances, that's all just illusory, well, again, illusions are not mere sheer nothingness. If they were, then we wouldn't even be able to talk about them. And moreover, right, you need to be able to account for, well, why these illusions, why any illusions, why these particular illusions based on your ontology. And someone like Spinoza just doesn't even ask, let alone answer those kinds of questions. And that's one of the big complaints that Hegel and to a lesser extent Schelling have about Spinoza. And these reactualizations of Spinoza's legacy, including Deleuzian ones, I think still are haunted by the same darn problem. And that, you know, if you just want to explain away rather than explain our senses of being subjects, et cetera, as illusory and so on, you know, that's just, I think, philosophically unsatisfying. It's just writing off a whole dimension of what it means to be human and saying that this is just null and void. This is nothingness and doesn't even call for an account. And that's a problem. You know, I think that's deeply intellectually unsatisfying. And I also think, too, that, look, you know, human beings sometimes live and die for illusions. And that indicates that these things are not epiphenomenal, right? Nobody ever died for an epiphenomenon, but we certainly have for illusions. And I think that these sorts of Spinozistic type metaphysical, you know, radically monist metaphysics in general, including, of course, going back before Spinoza to the Neoplatonists, for instance, any kind of radical monism of this sort inevitably has these problems that affect it, and I think render it incapable of being a truly exhaustive systematic metaphysics that is adequate in terms of being intellectually satisfying and that doesn't write off certain sectors of reality as unworthy of explanation.
Nance, now's your shot.
I think my question is too big. I actually weirdly wanted to ask you about Stephen Wolfram. I started reading about intelligence. So I was reading Negarestani, and then I went to Ben Goertzel, and from there I went to Stephen Wolfram, and then I'm working my way through his observer theory. But that kind of dovetails with this question from the chat that I thought would be interesting as well. And what is your challenge to Žižek seeing dialectical materialism in quantum physics?
That's Rudy's question. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and this debate, believe it or not, is still ongoing. So, you know, it goes back to you know, the first time when I kind of challenged Slavoj on this, you know, appeared in that same book from 2014, Adventures in Transcendental Materialism, that also contains the chapters on Hegel's Spinoza critique. And, you know, it's still, so even recently, you know, Žižek just released, you know, his Freedom, A Disease Without a Cure book. His book on Christian atheism is about to come out. And he kind of continues this debate with me in both of those books as well. And so there are further iterations I, you know, will have to develop. But for now, like what I can say, well, there are a couple of things that caused me to be deeply concerned here. You know, to begin with, and especially in terms of my initial criticisms of him for his ways of using quantum physics. You know, to begin with, of course, when we seek the basis of, because of course for Žižek, like me, the challenge is how do you develop a materialist ontology that includes rather than excludes subjectivity, right? If you want to put it in the simplest of terms. And the idea that, all right, we could find the basis of subjectivity in the physics of the smallest ultimate material building blocks of physical reality as we know it, that's the sort of sentiment that's reflective of a very traditional, highly reductive kind of materialism, the sort of materialism that Marx called contemplative materialism, which he thought basically indirectly aided idealists, because they would say, well, I've seen nothing resembling the human in these, mere atoms, falling in the void or bumping and grinding against each other, et cetera. And so at least idealism holds on to human subjectivity and tries to account for it. So, no thanks to materialism, right? I mean, it does a disservice to materialism. But, you have the prominent, mathematician, physicist, Roger Penrose, right? I mean, his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, was precisely an attempt to do what I think Slavoj in his own way is also attempting to do. And he hypothesizes that, well, we haven't solved the traditional Cartesian mind-body problem because we haven't been going far down enough in the physical, right? We've tended to just stop at the, biological level of the central nervous system and looked at the electrochemical activities involved with it, et cetera. But that hasn't helped us. So perhaps what we need to do is go all the way down to the bottom in terms of the physics of the extremely small, and that quantum mechanics, will enable us to develop a theory of mind compatible with scientific materialism. And that book, for both empirical and theoretical reasons, was deemed by most critics to be quite a failure, an interesting failure, but a failure. And the problem is, on a certain level, people like Penrose and Slavoj might indeed be right. I mean, it may be the case that somehow an adequate, theoretical appreciation of the implications of quantum mechanics will give us an account of mind or subjectivity compatible with a naturalist materialism. But we're very far from being able to say that. I mean, to be able to spell out the connection starting from the quantum level all the way up to the mid-scale objects that we are as human bodies, and then of course, along with that mind, all of that right now is just going to be like freewheeling speculation. I mean, speculation in the everyday sense of just loose imaginings of far off future possibilities, and I don't feel that that's solid enough ground to build anything philosophically on, at least for the time being. I mean, I think that if quantum mechanics is going to be able to do some of this work, it's not going to be for a heck of a lot longer than just a few years from now, and will require, I'm sure, a lot of sophisticated both empirical and philosophical bridge building, between the physics of the extremely small and such, macro objects as our central nervous systems. I think we're still a ways off from that. So I think Slavoj is kind of signing a giant speculative promissory note, like a big, theoretical IOU. And and he may end up being vindicated. He may not. I don't know. I don't think, neither he nor Penrose can really know either. And for me, I think there's much, just almost as a matter of an intellectual pragmatic move, there's much more work that I think can be done and can be grounded on well-established science and not involve nearly as much speculation. If we indeed stick with the you might say the material level immediately subjacent to our subjectivity, namely the biology of the human organism and its central nervous system, and that in particular focusing on neuroscientific work will allow us to have by most standards a materialistic, naturalistic enough account for the genesis of the peculiar non-natural subjectivities that we are, and that I would rather devote my limited time and energy in terms of philosophizing to establishing that linkage. And I don't think it would be incompatible. I mean, and then maybe in the future, we can also establish links right down to the level of things like quantum physics, but we're far from there yet. And so that's a big, a big issue that I have. But again, Žižek too, he's also like me, he considers himself as, very much a materialist who has some relationship specifically to the dialectical materialist tradition. And if there's one thing that anybody who identifies as a dialectical materialist has in common with other dialectical materialists, it is an anti-reductionism, right? The notion that a materialism that just says everything ultimately boils down to the smallest bits and pieces of physical matter, right? Whether it's ancient Greek atomism of certain sorts, or whether it's like a Newtonian style mechanical physical materialism, where it's just matter in motion, that's it, et cetera. I think that, both Žižek and I are, sufficiently strong anti-reductionists that we both reject that kind of approach to materialism. But it's almost as though that rejected version of reductive materialism in Slavoj returns, in the guise of, this old notion of, well, we can indeed, short circuit the divide between ourselves at one scale and then the lowest, smallest scale of physical matter is understood scientifically, and just, collapse this all down to that. And that seems at odds with all of the anti-reductive aspects that Žižek wants his materialism to have too. And so that's like a big pushback, against, his favoring or prioritizing of quantum mechanics, which he's stuck to. I mean, in fact, he's even more recently kind of doubled down on it. If you look at 2020's Sex and the Failed Absolute, I mean, he goes so far as to say that, the whole core of everything I've been pursuing philosophically over my career now comes down to, this reworking of dialectical materialism through a shotgun marriage that involves, among other core ingredients, quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics in conjunction with, the Lacanianized German idealism, and the Marxian influences that he mobilizes.
Awesome. Now, I know we really don't have time, but this is the question that I have to ask because it takes all the threads, kind of brings them back together. And I imagine you actually might have an elevator pitch, like short version of this, because you probably end up having to talk about this at conferences since you do fraternize with analytic philosophers. So you go to philosophy of science conferences, I imagine, publishing their journals, you have conversations with them. A lot of them are probably just like, what are you doing over there? Why are you doing stuff with those continental guys? Like you care about like epistemology. So why are you doing this, you're surrounded by these speculative people. They probably think of it in terms of obfuscation and romanticism. And so why are you in the continental camp? What do you say to a person who asks those kinds of questions?
Right. Well, at this point, I mean, yes, for convenience's sake, I can be identified as belonging to the continental camp. But, I am one of these people who's hoping that just by, trying to philosophize in a somewhat different way, instead of having to embrace or reject these labels, it could just basically render them, obsolete. And so for me, my way of doing this has ended up being, I'm interested in, first of all, just, the core questions that concern me as a philosopher are very recognizably traditional ones, which any philosopher of any orientation knows are, central enigmas for the entire philosophical tradition, going back to its roots in antiquity, right? Are we free or not? What is freedom? What is the mind? The nature of the mind-body relationship? Et cetera. I mean, these very classical, big picture metaphysical questions that are you could say centers of gravity for the Western philosophical tradition, and so that alone already makes me readily recognizable even by non-continental philosophers as, oh well, I can still see that. Yeah, here you're dealing with things in the mind-body jurisdiction. Here you're wrestling with issues which have to do with with freedom and agency, et cetera. And that, of course, makes it easier for me to talk to those people already. But then in addition, with the analytic philosophers, what I like to point out is, their ways of tackling these problems that they have, to some extent, I think arbitrarily and in a way that ultimately can't be defended as legitimate, have deprived themselves of some crucial resources for dealing with these issues. So, if you look at, especially with at this point now, the somewhat older generation of analytic philosophers, in terms of their sense of the history of Western philosophy, it's very standard that for them, all right, you study it up until Kant. And Kant, remains a very sober, level-headed, philosopher who, we analytics can still see the value of studying. There's still things to get out of him. And so like their history of philosophy education will go up to a certain version of Kant. It used to be P.F. Straussen's version of Kant from the Bounds of Sense. And then in their narrative, after Kant, the Germans just went crazy. And just spiraled off into this speculative bog of nonsense. And so for them, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, it's all just gobbledygook to be dismissed. And that they basically write off the entire European 19th century and then say, well, philosophy doesn't really resume being philosophy in the sense of sober, level-headed analysis, until, at the earliest, maybe Meinong, but especially Russell, Frege, Wittgenstein and company come on the scene. And then you have at the start of the 20th century, the emergence of analytic philosophy proper. And to me, it's precisely in that gap between Kant and Russell and company, where you have a bunch of things happen in the history of Western philosophy that I think are crucial to us making headway in relation to these traditional questions in a way that analytic philosophers are blind to, precisely because they treat all of this is just as nonsense. Now it's beginning to shift a little. I mean, thanks, especially with Hegel having, become at least a little more acceptable to analytic types, thanks to people at Pittsburgh and Chicago, especially, this more deflationary Hegelianism has allowed Hegel to, where essentially it's, don't worry, Hegel is still essentially a Kantian and, there's nothing to worry too much about in him, et cetera, but like a domesticated, defanged Hegel. But still, at least at this point, like my students who write Hegel dissertations aren't automatically condemned to unemployment because all of the analytic philosophers on their interview committees are like, well, anybody who talks about Hegel is just a priori full of shit. So that's a little bit of progress, right? And so it's like saying to them, hey, I use a very non-standard toolkit borrowed mainly from what is associated with continental philosophy to do to tackle the same sorts of questions and problems that plague analytic philosophers as much as non-analytic philosophers. And I think that plus like a commitment to writing clearly and to not trying to imitate in style and vocabulary certain of these continental authors, right? Like there's much too much commentary on authors like Lacan, where it just seems as though people are in the grip of the illusion that if you heap obscurity on top of obscurity, you somehow magically produce profundity. No, you just further muddy the waters. And so being able to explain people like Lacan to analytics is something that is valuable to me. And in part because, too, I get something out of that. It's almost like when I teach undergraduates, too. How do I know that, Lacan, Hegel, et cetera, aren't just, jargon mongering bullshitters? Well, that I can translate them out of their own vernacular and present them in terms that are accessible to non-Hegelians or non-Lacanians. And this, for me, is also a matter of helping to keep myself intellectually honest. So anyhow, that's, at least a sketch of a partial answer.
That's exactly perfect. Thank you so much. My God, I hope I'll be able to bring you back soon. And it's been an honor. Thank you so much for visiting. Take care. We'll be right back with Doug Lane, everybody.
Thank you both, David and Nance.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of the bullshit and just want to get down to it. Big ideas, rigorous thinking, and ultimately liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation. Theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. Besides a commitment to publishing certain underground theorists and popularizing certain fundamental concepts, we have toured the United States and are touring Europe to promote our ideas, courses, and publications.
You've been reading Underground Theory.
Amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag Free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first, obviously, I have to get freed myself, so the two of us are able to do this because, as Mikey said, build it and they will come. Well, I tried and I built a website and platform. I had my own app and everything, but it's been really buggy and it's more than one person can handle, and that's, a really good lesson for me. And so for now, what we're doing is moving it to a temporary intermediary platform until we are able to get some more serious funding. And ultimately, we want to be in a place like this, a real brick and mortar digital nomadic mecca where people can come from all over the world. But also, the app was really expensive, and so by quitting it, I am now able to save a lot of money, and with the help of my patrons and the students at Theory Underground, especially the monthly subscribers, I am officially able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. So thank you so much, everybody. This is one huge step forward. With that said, several subscribers did not migrate from the now defunct app to the new setup, and I'm guaranteed to lose people over time. So please, if you want to get involved, become a subscriber. If you're not even sure what this is all about but are just curious, then I've added Tier 0 and Tier 1 for very basic kinds of access to what we are doing behind the scenes. If you don't have any time or energy to get involved, but you do have some money to help support this project from afar, then please check out the Patreon. My patrons over at Patreon make the podcast and public YouTube possible. Thank you. As for once-in-a-lifetime events, check out the new poster for the American Idiots Theory Underground European Book Tour. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna, Linz, Krakow, Glasgow, London, and Oxford from April 27th to May 25th, 2024. 2 events are already fully booked out. Save a seat at an event by getting in contact with us ASAP. Finally, the call for proposals to our conference in Mexico on the last...
What's up, everybody? TUCon 2024 update here. It's not happening in Mexico anymore, but it is still happening on October 24th through the 27th.
The change was made because a lot of the people that wanted to attend and that were expected to attend said they could probably afford to travel if they had more time advance notice. So save up for June 2025.
If you have to choose, right? Because this one that is happening this year is happening physically in Boise, Idaho, because we have a lot of collaborators and fellow travelers and co-instructors there. But you can attend virtually for this one. You won't be able to attend virtually next year. So yeah, if you have to choose, attend physically in 2025. The call for proposals already happened. The writing workshop for proposals already happened. You can still get the links to both of those. Just shoot us a message and ask for those links. We'll get you those. And the form goes live on June 1st, and the deadline is June 15th. So if you're attending physically, let me know ASAP.
Get in on it.
All right. Finally, last little thing here is to say thank you so much to my patrons over at Patreon. The Patreon is for people who are too busy to be students or subscribers at Theory Underground, but who want to see more of this free content on the podcast and YouTube channel for Theory Underground. You are the ones who see something of value in the free content being made available here, and you want to see more of it. Your patron pledges at Patreon are a real motivator for me. So thank you so much, especially to Marilyn Lawrence, Bert Vanderkar, Carl Vanderlip, Nikolai, Sakil, Zoxandra, Darian, Max, Al, Alagiri, Ben, as well as several others, including Court Atlantic, Louise, Matt Payne, Neil, Simon, and Yiz.